This week, Lucy Powell was elected as the new deputy leader of the Labour Party. There was a big investment summit that took place in Birmingham, and Sarah Pochin, the Reform MP in Runcorn, got herself into some difficulties over some very, very unfortunate comments. We'll be discussing all that and more. I'm Frank McKenna, and this is the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
The return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Hey, it worked.
So welcome back to the Downtown Den Politics Podcast with me, Frank McKenna, this week joined by Joe Phillips and our man in the West Midlands and Birmingham, Kevin Johnson. Great to see you, Kevin. Welcome back to the Den.
Good to be here with you both.
Yeah, so much to talk about this week, but we're going to focus on three things in particular, as I say: the deputy leadership contest, result of which, of course, was announced on Saturday. Then we're going to turn our attention to a very positive investment summit that took place in Birmingham last week. And in the second part of the programme, we'll be looking at all things reform, the Caerphilly by-election, and Sarah Pochin's rather unfortunate comments, for which subsequently she has apologised. But let's start with that deputy leadership result. And I don't think there were any surprises, Kevin, in that Lucy Powell ended up as the eventual winner. Disappointing turnout for the contest, which I think demonstrates two things: perhaps Labour members' dissatisfaction with the performance of the government, generally speaking, but also this was a contest, of course, that nobody really wanted. It was forced because of the unfortunate resignation of Angela Rayner. I said last week, Kevin, that I didn't think Keir Starmer would be losing too much sleep about Lucy Powell becoming deputy leader. She doesn't seem to me to be the sort of character that is going to be going out causing trouble on a daily basis. But of course, the media would see it differently and are saying this could be Andy Burnham's Trojan horse candidate on the NEC and within the Parliamentary Labour Party. For what it's worth, we've worked with Lucy for many years now at Downtown in Business. Of course, I've known her because of her role as Manchester Central MP, but then in the various shadow and ministerial roles she's had, always found her to be, first and foremost, very effective member of Parliament, an effective minister. Was surprised that she was actually sacked from the cabinet a couple of months ago. But more importantly, perhaps, very, very much a loyalist to whoever the leader of the Labour Party is. So my view, Kevin, is an appointment that, OK, Starmer would not necessarily have wished for, but not one that's going to create too many problems for him either.
Yeah, I agree. But I do think your point about turnout needs to be underlined. What was it, about 16%?
16%, yeah.
I mean, that is pretty much atrocious, and it's not that hard to take part in the election. It's a couple of buttons to press on the computer. So that tells you something, doesn't it? Even when there could be lots of people, including affiliated members, who could express their lack of hope or lack of trust in the government, they chose not to use that facility, which is to a degree surprising, given how easy it is to vote. They don't even have to walk down to a polling station. And I think also the gap between the two was less than some people predicted. People were saying Lucy Powell's there to sort of, be a bit of a Trojan horse for giving Starmer a kick. And, it wasn't that big a difference, was it? So that's worth saying. I think so far, both in the campaign and her comments yesterday, she's been pretty reasonable and trying to carve out a position which says that I'm going to be here for the Labour Party, to espouse Labour values and to be a sort of critical friend outside of the cabinet. So far, if that's the function she performs, and she puts a bit of a check and gives a bit of a different channel of communication through to the government, through to Starmer, that's a good thing. But we've never seen this before, have we? I think it is since about 1950 odd, since there was a deputy leader of the Labour Party who did not sit in the cabinet. So we're in pretty much uncharted territory in that sense. I've always found Lucy, you know her much better than I did, Frank. I found her better when she's not speaking for the party, when she's not been doing a cabinet job or a shadow cabinet job, when she's been speaking without the constraints of lines to take, etc., I found her quite a degree more impressive. So I think, and given her performance in the last 24 hours, I think she'll be even more effective outside the cabinet than possibly she was inside it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, actually, Kevin. She's an impressive performer, but as you say, the more authentic she can be, the better, in a sense. And we suspected, Joe, didn't we, that one of the reasons she was moved out of the cabinet was because perhaps she'd been a bit too honest. But honesty and constructive criticism might just be what this government needs, particularly when it comes to some of its political decision making and its communications.
Oh, absolutely. And as we have said, for weeks and weeks and weeks ad nauseum, the one thing that this government can't do is communicate. And Lucy is very good. I mean, as Kevin says, she's authentic, she's real, she speaks human, she engages with people. What I think is quite ridiculous, and I wonder whether Keir Starmer might be kicking himself, is that by making David Lammy Deputy Prime Minister as well as Justice Secretary, he completely closed off the door for the Deputy Leader to be Deputy Prime Minister, which is an odd thing to have done, because, when you knew that Angela Rayner was going, you knew there was going to be a vacancy for Deputy Leader, if indeed you need one, and a vacancy for Deputy Prime Minister. So, you could have said, oh, well, let's just wait and see what's happened with the deputy leadership contest. I mean, yes, I think Kevin makes a really good point. If she's not in cabinet, but she will attend cabinet, she does have a voice and she does have an authority. But I do think, a 16% turnout is absolutely shocking, which, does that mean people have given up, or they don't care, or they think there wasn't much to choose between either her or Bridget Phillipson?
I think it's probably a combination of all things. I think that the role itself is perhaps not seen by party members as being as critical as it once was. But I actually think that the point Kevin makes about this position now being sat outside the cabinet could make it a more interesting position. And if she can start to utilise that campaigning talent that she has, she's a very, very good campaigner, Lucy Powell. She's been around the Labour Party for many years, as I say. And if she can start to be a voice that feeds back constructively into the government what people on the ground are actually saying, then that could be really useful. And I suspect that in the cold light of day, Bridget Phillipson is perhaps waking up. And of course, nobody likes to lose a high-profile election in whatever circumstances. But she may be thinking, Kevin, well, at least I can now focus and crack on with that very, very important job of Education Minister, where she's doing some sterling work, it has to be said. So where do you think it leaves Bridget Phillipson?
Yeah, I think given the gap between the two, and there was a feeling that Lucy Powell would walk it, and she didn't really walk it, whether by a clear majority, that's no bad thing. But I think if you've got Education Secretary, you just brought out a skills white paper last week. If I remember rightly, she's the Women and Equalities Minister as well.
Yeah, as well.
The lead on that. Did you really need to be Deputy Leader at the same time as all of that? Suggest not. I think you've probably got enough on your plate and get on with it. Yes, as you say, nobody likes to lose, but actually you can gain from these experiences having gone through that. Maybe it's a bit of a test for when the big job comes up. She's sort of tested herself in a campaign. But I think she's been pretty impressive, Minister Bridget Phillipson. I thought, if I remember rightly, she came to the fore through a by-election, I seem to remember, and she was pretty impressive. I do think she is by no means alone. They come across not as good as they were since they've been doing their jobs in cabinet. We come back to our recurring theme that the three of us would always say, that there aren't many good communicators in this government, and they really, really, really need good communicators. And I fear that some of them are getting worse communicators with the constraints of government, the constraints of lines to take, the briefings they're getting in government than they were before. And if I were Bridget Phillipson, I'd probably be looking back at the campaign and thinking, how do I become, take Joe's term, how do I become more authentically myself as a political operator when I do potentially contest the big job next time?
Yeah, I think a lot of them in the cabinet should be having that conversation with themselves. I was listening to a really interesting conversation between, who was it, Lewis Goddard and Neil Kinnock on a podcast a few weeks ago. And Kinnock actually said one of his big challenges was not being himself once he became leader of the Labour Party. And I think that the people that we will have met in real life, if I can use that term, are totally different. You know, even Starmer, Rachel Reeves, Bridget Phillipson, you know, they are human beings who are actually do have personalities, are good communicators, and it amazes me that when that red light goes on, they all of a sudden turn into these robots, Joe. It's incredible.
Yeah, but I think that's part of that is, media training and knowing the lines to take. Part of it is lack of experience in being confronted with what seems to be an avalanche on a daily basis of bad news, some of which is completely out of the government's control. So you go on, like Steve Reed did this morning, to talk about, the call for social housing landlords to have a time limit on repairs and things like that, but obviously ended up talking about the Epping migrant bid for freedom, if you like, the absolute cock up that was, and the Home Affairs Select Committee into asylum hotels. So they're always, but that that goes with the job. And there is a point where you want to say to people, you will only come across as real if you believe what you're saying and if you have confidence in what you're doing. And I think Kevin's absolutely right, because I've always thought Bridget Phillipson is really impressive. She sounds human, but as the months have gone by, she's become more robotic. And it's a real shame, because you take that away and, as you say, Frank, you meet all these people in different circumstances. Gordon Brown is the perfect example, who came across as absolutely dull as ditchwater, who was actually funny, thoughtful, a good listener, compelling, a great raconteur, but that never came across. And part of it is, I think, we're not just looking for the soundbite for the 6 o'clock news. We are dealing in a landscape, if you like, where whatever you say is going to be clipped. So everybody remembers an island of strangers from Keir Starmer's speech. They don't remember the rest of it. And so I think, there's an essence that you're on a tightrope and you're blinking into the headlights, because whatever you say is going to be taken out of context by somebody who will use it. But it is about having that confidence and that sort of being comfortable in your own skin, which I think is the point that Neil Kinnock was saying, that, and around any politician at a high level, there will be people who want to manipulate them, to mould them, to, flick their hair this way, to brush their shoulders off dandruff and all of those things, some of which are, is a good thing to do, actually, in the dandruff. But you know what I mean? And actually, there's a point where they need to go, no, I just need to be me. But when you haven't got the space, the bandwidth, to use that awful phrase, because you're so busy, you just go from one studio to another with somebody behind you who never does the interviews, but who's telling you how they think it should be, but never listening. And sometimes, actually, what I always say to people is, just listen to yourself back. Watch it. It's horrible, but you will see whether that's the you want to be.
Kevin, as somebody who's been both sides of the camera and comms, obviously do an awful lot of advice with politicians, and I'm sure you talk from time to time about how they may better project themselves. It's a tough one, isn't it? But what would you be saying to some of those government ministers in terms of improving the way in which they are coming across to the public?
Yeah, I think I will come to that. I think the other thing I just had to Joe's sort of list of the sort of issues that go into it is that people are so worried about making a mistake. Yeah. And they're worried about the bear trap. They're worried about the thing they haven't heard of, they haven't been briefed about, and suddenly some clip comes up and they're going to respond to it, whatever. So that's always there, and we know plenty of politicians who've suffered because of that, perhaps unfairly. I think you've got to be human. You've got to be yourself. You've got to try and imagine yourself in the kind of normal kind of situations, domestic situation in your community, in the pub, whatever. rather than just thinking this is. I think too many politicians, and too many high-profile business people as well, they feel as if they're in a fight and they've been sort of geared up to, this is what the interview is going to come at you with, and this is how you sort of divert, this is how you move on, this is how you dilute. And really, there's not that many interviews where that happens. Okay, today at 8:10 can often be like that in other interviews, but often, if you're on some kind of media platform, particularly you reckon podcasts, as we are now, but Lewis Goodall podcast and other ones, people are looking for a longer conversation. They are looking, we're speaking does this well, I think. There are formats now where you can get a longer form view to promote your policy or to talk about your values or whatever it might happen to be. So I think you've got to use those. Yes, you've got to be careful about what something might look like in social media clips, etc. But I think, search for the authentic you. Try and use those platforms which are not just about the short broadcast clips or the social media clips. And don't always listen to the likes of me and Joe. Don't always listen to those.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Don't always listen to those damned advisors. You've got a gut of your own. You've got, most of these politicians got to where they are because, as you referenced from Lucy, they've been campaigning in the field for years upon years upon years, and trade unions, whatever route they came from, or they've been lawyers, and they now do. Always surprises me how poor Starmer is in government, given he was the top barrister, albeit he got there being a defence barrister rather than a prosecution barrister. So I think probably also they've got their own SPADs, and they've got the civil service machine, and they've just got too many voices. And actually, they should be more careful about where they take their advice from, and probably, listening to what their mate says or what their mum tells them. It's probably going to be just as valuable as the likes of what Joe or I tell them.
Yeah, I don't want this podcast to turn into the Wes Streeting Appreciation Society, because our producer Francesca is a huge fan of his as well. But I seen Wes doing a couple of media interviews yesterday, and he is probably the one guy who does basically say, well, this is what I think. And on the release of The Prisoner, which we'll talk a little bit about in the second part of today's programme, he didn't try and use mealy mouthed words. He didn't try and suggest that, oh well, never mind. He just called it out for what it was: bloody shambles. And I think that the more that they can get into that mindset of just being themselves and talking to the camera in the way they would somebody in a pub or in a community centre or at a surgery, the better. And like you, Kevin, I'd be interested to get your view on this, Joe. It's a long time since I was a politician, but I always treated a journalist as a friend. Go in and have the conversation. Okay, one or two of them would try and trip you up, but most of them are simply looking to get a decent story, get something out there. And the other thing that I always find rather amusing and quite frustrating in one sense is when, and it's usually Nick Ferrari, who's quite an aggressive interviewer, comes up with some statistic, throws it at the minister, and the minister gets all flustered because they don't know the number. Now, I was in that situation on many, many occasions. I know this will surprise you. People asking me about numbers and statistics when I was leader at Lancashire County Council or the Regional Assembly, and they're throwing these figures. And I just used to say, I don't know.
Yeah.
I can find out if you want. But actually, my job is to look at the policy, the strategy. Yeah. If you want to know the figures, I'll get someone on here to tell you the figures, but let's move on. Instead, what these ministers try and do now is, hang on, I'm awfully sorry, Nick, I didn't know the actual number. Alison McGovern got caught doing it a few weeks ago, and, one of the most unflappable people you'll meet ordinarily. Why don't they just get into that space, Joe, of going on to an interview? They're not going to know everything. Steve Reed this morning, for example, honestly, if I'd have been in his situation, I've not heard the interview, but I'd have said, I'm here to talk about housing.
Yeah.
If you want to talk about that issue, get the Home Secretary on or somebody from the Home Office. I want to talk about social housing.
And the whole point about doing that is you move it on because you close down that bit. And that is, one of the first things that you teach people when you do media training. This sounds like an advert, doesn't it, for me and Kevin? Also, media training is available from Jim Hancock. If he's not here. But I think, you're absolutely right about Wes Street. And, the way he's come out and said it how it is to the BMA, the way he's said the NHS is hanging by a thread. Well, I was on GB News last week and they were going, oh, who ever heard a health secretary saying the NHS is hanging by a thread? And I thought, well, actually, it is. And the BMA aren't helping. So come out and say it how it is. And it is that thing about, you stand next to somebody, I don't know, waiting to buy a pint or at a football match, or you sit next to somebody on a train or something and they say, what do you do? Well, you tell them in ordinary language. And I think you make a really good point, Frank, about this idea that all journalists are the enemy is ridiculous. And, the days of Jeremy Paxman are long gone. There's Nick Ferrari and Andrew Neil, I would say, are probably the best, really sort of probing interviewers who will push people. But look how Liz Truss, remember her, completely screwed up on her round of local radio by not recognising that local radio producers, reporters and presenters are just as valid as the big shots, like Laura bloody Koonsberg. And I just think it's that thing about, just what do you want to say to the people who you want to vote for you? You're talking to them, and stop thinking about talking to the media. And, then you end up with, it's my particular bugbear, you end up with speeches that are written by committee with ridiculous phrases and things in, and you end up with stuff that hangs around your neck like an albatross.
Well, they must improve because they continue to struggle in terms of the polls and in terms of getting their message out there. But let's hope Lucy Powell can do something to turn the dial and start to make those communications that have been pretty poor up until this point a little bit better moving forward. The one thing that was very well communicated last week, and I thought was really positive, Kevin, was the investment summit that took place in Birmingham. And I've seen masses of really positive news stories coming out from there, particularly from my friend Neil Rami at the West Midlands Growth Company, who keeps sending me these snippets of fabulous features about Birmingham and the West Mids. A great one in the Financial Times over the weekend. Don't know if you saw that, but it was great that the city hosted the summit, and some really positive things came out of it, Kevin.
Yeah, I will just make one short point, which kind of links between our last conversation and this one, is that I wasn't there myself, but I did watch some of the opening, and obviously spoken as you have to people afterwards. And I did watch Rachel Reeves's opening speech, who continues to be over-reliant on auto-cue and a pretty poor performer of using auto-cue. So I would just sort of slightly add to your last point, Frank, about speeches and how they use them and being overly wedded to auto-cue, particularly when they're using the pop-up glass version. They've got to look more authentic. People know that you're reading a script. People know that you're reading off and off, auto-cue in those big rooms. But you've got to get better at it, really, because if it constantly looks like you're looking at the two screens and you're swapping between the two and not engaging the audience, both in the room and those watching online by the Treasurer's LinkedIn feed, it doesn't look like they're your words. So just to throw that in. But other than that, I think, two things I'd say. One is the government had a big one, I think was at Lancaster House last year, not long after they came into power. This one they decided, with a lot of lobbying from Richard Parker, the regional mayor, to host it in Birmingham. It was at Edgbaston, the cricket ground, and was very well staged. They threw resource at it. They had a number of government ministers there. There was a pre-dinner the night before. They did a great tour of the University of Birmingham, which was fantastically executed, and had a cultural programme, had great food, showed off that facility and the city and the region very well. And as you said, a number of strong announcements that came out of it, not just about Birmingham and the West Midlands, but also about lots of money and investment into other regions, including the Northwest, which apparently is quite important, Frank. So all of that was good. It was well done, and I did say to somebody from the growth company last week, what's the feeling inside? And they said that Neil Rami was happy. Now, I was surprised at this because I've never seen Neil Ryan happen. So it must have gone well.
Yeah, he is very chipper about it. As I say, I've had several messages from him since. Am I right in saying that Tom Werner, the owner of Birmingham City, was one of the people on the platform as well?
Yes.
Because, again, I think this is one of the things I would say about Birmingham, because it has had a lot of bad press in recent weeks. You know, you've had the bin strike, obviously, the council going bankrupt. So not great news, but lots of fabulous things happening. And the big infrastructure project that is largely hated by much of the country and government ministers, HS2, is proven to be a genuine boost for Birmingham. And of course, the football ownership of Birmingham City have looked at HS2 as a great opportunity, and one of the reasons, I'm told, that they decided to invest in the club so heavily, Kevin.
Yeah, that's right. And you should say the sports quarter, the whole sort of development going in around Birmingham City, the tram investment that came out a few weeks ago, obviously linking through to HS2. I mean, it's massive. And what I would say also is that you have to give credit, and this was happening under the last mayor as well, but you have to give credit to Richard and his team, because I think they have put the work in, both into that development and to some of the other announcements that came out, and into the growth plan and the investment plan that came out last week. And a bit like National Gov, there is an awful lot of good work going on underneath the surface at a regional level and a national level. Lots of plans and strategies being put in place. And the recurring theme is, of course, notwithstanding last week, it's not been terribly well communicated. It's hard, of course, to talk about 5-year, 10-year plans and how that makes a difference to people's lives today, tomorrow, and next week. But there is great work going on, and politicians, I think, and the machines around them have to find new ways to try and communicate what that means and why putting in long-term efforts into transport infrastructure, into stadium developments, etc., is so important, and that the results will come out, if not tomorrow, but in a few years' time. So I think that's what I'm saying. I think the other thing is, you know this, frankly, given the city you're in, football is incredibly important. And not only have we had problems with bin strike, but we've had 2 football teams which haven't been performing at the top of their game for some time. And I'm tempted to say all of a sudden, but it's not all of a sudden. We've got 2 football clubs in this city which are investing in their stadia, investing in their communities, and doing better and better on the pitch. And I do think over time that will be more important to Birmingham's reputation than a few problems with referees.
Yeah, absolutely agree. If Birmingham City can get promoted to the Premier League, what an absolute boost that will give to the city's economy. And of course, you got Woes only down the road as well. So, well, we'll see if they stay up. We're not having the best of seasons, but in general terms, I think the West Midlands is in a really positive place, and Birmingham in particular, I think, could see the next 4 or 5 years as a bit of a golden era. But the other thing that struck me, Joe, was that it was good to see the Chancellor and other ministers all in the same room outside of a Labour Party event, a Labour Party conference. And I wondered why they don't do this more often. They could go around the country, couldn't they, doing these sort of things? I'm not suggesting they do big summits every time they go out, but a couple of government ministers in a room on a quarterly basis, talking about those longer term plans, as Kevin said, explaining to people what is going on in government outside of asylum seekers and Prince Bloody Andrew, and start to actually directly talk to people through those sort of set piece discussions where you can have longer conversations, where you will pick up an awful lot of local and regional media interest as well, because you're in their places, and take a bit of a leaf out of our good friend Donald Trump's book and flood the zone with alternative stuff. Because in the absence of you doing that, the media will just continue to focus on the negative stories that they think is going to get clicks.
Absolutely. And, you know, by doing things like that, like the Birmingham Summit or, you know, Manchester, Liverpool, Bristol, wherever it is, you're actually talking to people who will then go and evangelise for you, know, whether they're council leaders or business leaders or football club owners or, you know, just local people or local councillors. And as you say, you know, you use that opportunity to go and visit schemes, projects, do local radio, do local telly, you know, do an interview with the local paper. Obviously not if you're Reform in Nottingham, because they're not allowed to speak to the local paper. But, you know, all of those things, and it gets you out of that Westminster bubble. And it also means that you come back. And of course, you know, MPs have got their own constituencies that are not all in London by a long chalk. But, you know, you actually need that thing that somebody goes back and says, well, I was talking to Richard, you know, at West Midlands, la, 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 building on what Andy Street did, la, 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 la. Now Labour's taking it forward. You know, all of those sort of conversations and telling that story. And I think it is also about when you go to a place where work is underway, you actually can see for yourself as a minister or an MP, you can see the progress and you can come back and you can say whether it's, you know, another mile of HS2 has been laid at a cost of, you know, more than the entire budget for their NHS. Or you can say, I went to this amazing project, which is doing X with young offenders or asylum seekers or young people out of work, out of education. You know, there's 1,000,001 stories in every single town and city around this country that get no coverage for, you know, reasons that we've discussed previously. But actually, it's a really good chance. And if I was doing the grid, as they call it, you know, when you're working out who's on duty and who's going where and why, they don't need to be big deals. They, you know, Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds, Sheffield, they're not far from London. You can do those things. And actually, you almost need, well, Keir Starmer is, you know, back and forth across the Atlantic, across the Channel and hither and yon, doing excellently on the world stage. You almost need in parallel to, as you say, Frank, flood the zone with other ministers going north, west, south and east to say, this is what we're doing. This is what we, you know, come and have a look. Because it's when you talk to people who have got no faith, you know, go down to Margate and talk to them and say, look, this is what's happening here with the new community health centre. This means you don't have to go, you know, 35 miles on a very complicated bus route to go and get a blood test, for instance. You know, all of those little things. And everybody will go, well, I met that Rachel Reeves. She's not as dull as she looks on the telly. Actually, she's quite nice. Got lovely shiny hair. And we had a long chat about uncomfortable shoes. They're human, you know? And it does more than any leader column in the Times or any successful dodging Nick Ferrari's questions.
Yeah, but she does need to learn to use an auto cue
more or don't use an auto cue.
Or don't use one at all.
Don't use one. You know, it's really hard to do. It is a skill. And actually don't use an auto cue. Do the old fashioned thing. Use notes and have, you know, memory cards.
Yeah. I just wanted to end the first session of the podcast today, Kevin, on asking more generally how Birmingham is feeling these days, because obviously I did reference the fact that it's gone through some pretty tumultuous times in the recent past. As I say, some of these longer term and big investment projects that are happening, of course, are longer term. But on the ground at this moment in time, what are you sensing? Do you think the city council is still in a bit of trouble? I'm talking electorally now, of course.
Yeah, well, it's certainly in trouble, both in terms of its organisation and finances and so on. And certainly in trouble, I think, in terms of the mayor elections, which is beginning to focus everyone's mind. Whether Reform, you know, get enough votes to take over is one thing, but them having a big zinc into the Labour majority, of what may come of that is becoming a higher and higher risk. And of course, as we've talked about, it's quite difficult to engage with Reform if you take into account that they may have at least more seats, if not some hold on power. You want to engage with them so they understand what they're coming into and they understand business perspectives of other lobbies. They're very difficult get sort of hold on and difficult to sort of start doing proper business engagement, public affairs type work with. So that's also an issue. But what I would say, I think, if you had Neil Rami on this podcast, he would say, look, for all the kind of tittle tattle about bins and other issues in Birmingham, just as any other city and flags or whatever else, the reality of it is when he and his guys are talking to international investors and other investors about relocating or putting more facilities together, particularly the sort of growth of tech and AI, etc. Not that they don't care, but they can see beyond the short-term issues that any city or any place goes through or any political organisation goes through, and they can see the fundamentals, and the fundamentals are strong. There is massive, massive issues about around skills and the skills gap of people coming out with not enough qualifications, etc. But the fundamentals of the business community, the fundamentals, particularly in creative industries, in tech, it was a Tech WM week last week, special week on tech, which went very well. On some of these, on professional services, on a whole life sciences, on a whole range of sectors, Birmingham is doing incredibly well with some absolutely fantastic assets, which Neil and his team and the Mayor and his team are promoting. So there is a difference. There's a difference between the reality and some of the headlines. But notwithstanding that, I think if you ask the business community, they'd like the city council to finish the job of sorting itself out. And perhaps if it begins to do that, it may be able to stave off the threat of having a council that might invest more in flags and not interact with the media as you get in Nottinghamshire.
Yeah. Yes, it's going to be an interesting 6 months or so. And just to reference an event that we are hosting, Downtown in Business, alongside Aston University, at Aston University on the 4th of November, where Joanne Roney, the Managing Director of Birmingham City Council, will be joining us, along with a whole host of other speakers. Most impressively, as far as I'm concerned, with due respect to everybody else who's going to appear on that day, Carl Ennis, who's the Chief Executive of Siemens, who I'm particularly looking forward to hearing from. So if you are around Birmingham on the 4th of November, please feel free to come and join us. Go to our website, all the W's, downtowninbusiness.com, for details. Right, we'll take a short break. When we come back, we'll be talking about Caerphilly by-elections. I never thought I'd say that on a podcast. And reform. Stay with us. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to the second part of this week's Downtown Zen Politics podcast with me, Frank McKenna, Joe Phillips and Kevin Johnson. So let's talk about reform then. They've had an interesting week and perhaps not the best of 7 days in reform short history, Joe. I'm coming to you first because of course you regularly sit alongside its leader, Nigel Farage, on GB News. I'm sure he's had better weeks, hasn't he? Because he suffered a defeat in Caerphilly, which was expected to win. The polls were all suggesting that reform were going to romp home. Notwithstanding, it was a terrible result for Labour because they'd held that seat for like a million years and ended up finishing third. Plaid Cymru eventually won the seat. But nonetheless, it was a surprise, I think, to reform and to the commentators that they didn't win that seat. And then Sarah Pochin's put a size 11s in it with some very distasteful comments about, of all things, adverts on the telly, which I didn't think anyone watched these days for a start. But if you're going to watch them, then let's not start making them into some sort of EDI discussion and debate. So what have you made of Reforms Week, Joe?
Well, I think they were expecting to walk it in Caerphilly, even though, you know, they didn't read the room. Immigration is not a huge issue in Wales. There are many, many other things, but the cost of living and the health service far outweigh immigration. So the fact that Plaid Cymru won, you know, we can draw a veil over Labour's disastrous result, but I think it was to be expected. And of course, Reform will say that their vote share increased massively, which indeed it did. But there are two interesting takeaways from that. One is they assumed they'd win. So that is a bit of a battering to their egos, of which there are many. And the other thing is that there is some suggestion that Plaid won because there was a a cohort of tactical voting to keep reform out. Now, I think that is actually the real positive and the most interesting takeaway, because obviously the rest of the country doesn't have devolved or nationalist parties like the SNP and Plaid. So if that is the way people are thinking, let's stop reform, then there is hope of a progressive alliance, which then means, you bring in, we've talked last week about the Greens and how they're attracting young people. And I know many people, younger people who've signed up, they're out delivering leaflets. They're not just saying, oh, I like Zach Polanski. They're out there doing stuff, and that is a new generation of political activists, which coming up to next May's election is really important. The other thing, Sarah Pochin, she's an absolute charmer, this woman. You might remember she won the Runcorn and Helsby by-election. And she's her first question in the House of Commons was about banning the burqa, which went down like a cup of cold sick with reforms. I can't remember what position he had at the time. I think he was head of their Doge unit before he resigned in hissy fit and then went back after 3 days. Zia Youssef, who said it was rather stupid, and obviously didn't know that she was going to ask that question. I don't know whether the other, I think there might have been 4 MPs, then possibly 5, who knows, I can't keep up. But that went down particularly badly. She was on Talk TV, a Talk TV phone-in. I mean, who knew and who was listening? And somebody phoned in apparently and said that they got fed up with seeing too many black and brown faces on TV adverts. And she said, she agreed. She said she was driven mad by seeing adverts full of black and Asian people. And it's quite astonishing, really, because it's that sort of casual racism. And to go back to Wes Streeting, he was the first government minister to call it out, absolutely. And he said, what she said was a disgrace. It was racist. And the deafening silence from Nigel Farage said it all. It took quite a long time before the Shadow Home Secretary, Chris Philp, actually said, yes, it is racist. But first of all, they go around the houses and, well, I wouldn't use terms like that, but what Reform are doing, and it's not just Reform actually, because we had a couple of weeks ago the charmer Robert Jenrick talking about not seeing a white face in Harmsworth, and he didn't want to live in a country like that. Well, presumably the people without a white face in Harmsworth are quite happy to see adverts full of black and brown people because that reflects the area they live. I mean, they are just so absolutely all over the place on this, and this casual racism, this casual disregard and going, oh, well, that's not what I meant, what I meant. Are we really going back to the days of Stanley Baxter dressing up and putting on ridiculous accents? Are we going to bring back the black and white minstrels? Or have we actually moved on to be a sensible, inclusive, tolerant country where we recognise people as neighbours and citizens, regardless of the colour of their skin? It's absolutely appalling. And we need to call it out for what it is. I mean, it's a little bit like the flag flying nonsense, which is, only white people, preferably if they've got shaven heads and tattoos, they're the only people that can fly the flag. And we're about to go into this, probably be very controversial. We're into that period now, coming up to Armistice Day, about wearing poppies. Now, I don't wear poppies until the 1st of November. There's no hard and fast rule, but that's a sort of standard thing. But if you don't wear a poppy, I bet you this year there will be even more of the sort of, the pop, you don't wear a poppy, you're not a patriot sort of thing. And I think, on a day like this, when we've got the Reform's only woman MP saying something as disgusting as that, but today, the King is unveiling a memorial to gay, lesbian and queer soldiers and armed service personnel, 25 years after, only 25 years after it stopped being illegal to be homosexual in the armed forces. Now, what country do we want to be? I'd rather be the one that's celebrating at the Arboretum, not Sarah Pochin's country where she doesn't like seeing a brown face on the telly.
I do think it's rather ironic that at one level they're calling for integration and then they're complaining about black and brown faces on television.
Yeah.
Seems to be a little contradictory to me. But just on the broader point, Kevin, and going back to that by-election, that, as I said earlier, Reform were expected to win handsomely. And Nigel Farage spent more time in Wales, I'd suggest, than he has in Clacton since he was elected MP there, expecting, as I say, to gain victory. What does it tell us about the electorate generally, or does it not tell us much? Is this just a by-election in isolation, or is it evidence that actually people aren't really ready for this radical populist right-wing party, and where necessary they will vote tactically? And just let me also say that the turnout was 50%. We talked earlier about that poor turnout for the Labour deputy leadership election. But by-election in Wales, this is unheard of. So 50% of people were exercised enough to say, I'm not having a populist party in my place. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we should never draw too many conclusions from one by-election result, is the first thing to say, by way of health warning. That being said, yeah, I think probably it's the tactical voting, as you both touched on, that people came up because Reform seemed so confident and the polls were showing they were looking in a good place, and because Nige kept turning up, it seems that more people came out generally to vote, and certainly more people came out in order to put a stop to Reform. That seems to be what has happened. But I think the bigger issue is, and it was no surprise that Labour did that badly, but they did really badly, really badly, absolutely in the sweet spot of where the Labour Party effectively comes from in many ways. And we shouldn't get too carried away that the Clyde politician who won is a well-known candidate. He's stood in that seat, I think, both Westminster and Cardiff parliaments for some time, well-known and I think well-respected as a person who believes in his community, supports and campaigns for his community. Reform, they tried and they were killed off at the end. The real lesson is for Labour, isn't it? If you're losing your heartlands, you're doing something very, very wrong. And just as we were saying about Lucy Powell earlier, it'll be interesting to see the diversion in terms of language that comes from Cardiff Labour politicians that are coming from Westminster politicians in the lead up to the Senate elections.
I would
and
just...
one thing, of course, sorry, Joe, just to get your thoughts on the comments from Sarah Pochin, Kevin, because, of course, one of the very distinctive comments that Lucy Powell made in her acceptance speech was, we can't out-reform reform. And I thought it was interesting that Wes Streeting was first out of the blocks to call her out. There was, again, this mealy-mouthed approach from Number 10 initially when they were asked for comment. And there's got to be a plan and a consistency of approach with this issue. So at conference, Keir Starmer makes arguably his best speech and basically says, where racism exists, we're going to call it out. Where racist language is used, we're going to go for them. And yet the first opportunity he had to be really strong on that, he didn't take it. Now, subsequently he has. But it seemed to me that he was almost standing back and seeing what the reaction was instead of taking the lead. And once she'd apologised for those comments, Sarah Pochin, and, just for the record, she's saying she was sort of misunderstood. She didn't really want to come across like that. I just think it's dog whistle stuff, this. But Labour, as you say, Kev, they've got to get the messaging on this right, because they did look all over the place for a couple of days.
I mean, let's just say it, Sarah Pochin, lovely woman. I mean, wouldn't you just like to spend an evening with her?
I'm sure we can arrange it, Kevin. Make a great podcast.
Get her on. No, I mean, we often talk when the three of us together about communications and just how poor this government is at it. I think the deeper problem is their antennae, their political antennae is on. And, the sort of communication comes afterwards. It's not the substance of the people around it. their ability to kind of read a situation and their ability to act quickly, and then yes, to put it into some kind of communication plan and interviews, whatever else. And that's what worries me most, I think, about Keir Starmer and his operation, which keeps sort of changing very, very frequently indeed. And they've got to have a better antenna for these things. Then I think the other thing that, moving on to the Sarah Pochin thing, but the other thing that Lucy Powell picked up on is this point about digital ID cards. I'm not going to get into that as a policy. This came out as a big sort of pre-announcement on the Thursday or Friday before Star's, as you say, pretty good speech. But then nothing.
Yeah.
Now, in the days of old, you'd trail something, you put it in the speech, and then you'd go off for a week or two, just sort of banging away at the policies you've just unveiled. Nothing until a couple of days ago. Nothing again on digital ID cards, and I don't think they've got the messaging right on it at all. So that tells you that there is something even more fundamental than communications. There's the sort of policy agenda, but even before that, it's the antenna to deal with situations like this. And notwithstanding what I said earlier about not being a slave to social media, to broadcast media clips, you have got to be on top of it. You have got to be able to, grab hold of the zeitgeist and do something with it. And they didn't do that with this, what was clearly dog whistle politics.
And Sarah Pochin may not be the best communicator as far as reform are concerned, but Nigel Farage is a good communicator. And what he will be doing this week, Joe, is trying to move the discussion on and move it on quickly. And of course, there's a story that's emerged today, this report that's been published. Home Office squandered billions on asylum hotels, and he will be all over this like a rash. Again, why isn't the government, looking at the news now, I'm not seeing this yet, and it may happen. Shabana Mahmood may take the cudgels up as far as this is concerned, but the government needs to get ahead of this and be saying, hey, we didn't sign any of these contracts, guys.
Yeah, exactly. And I have no doubt that that's what I shall be discussing tomorrow night on GB News next to Nigel Farage. But I mean, Kevin's absolutely right, and we've said it before, they haven't got political antennae. It's about being instinctive. If any of us were standing in a pub or were in an office or something, and somebody said something racist like that, you wouldn't stop to think about it. You would say, oi, cut it out. Now, if that is not your instinct and you're waiting, how are you going to empower the population to have the confidence to call that out in the workplace, for instance, or at school? The other thing that I think might have been a factor in the Caerphilly by-election, of course, which will be another thing that is looming on the horizon for reform, is Nathan Gill, who, of course, was their leader in Wales, who has pled guilty to asking questions when he was an MEP in the European Parliament, being paid on behalf of the Russians. Now, he's due to be sentenced next week, I think. So that has not had the coverage that it would have had it been a Labour MP or even a Conservative MP, but certainly hasn't had the same coverage as the rather peculiar China spy scandal. And I think that is something, and you're absolutely right, Nigel Farage will move the debate on. It'll all be about asylum hotels, even though those contracts were signed in 2019. I think before Keir Starmer was even leader of the Labour Party and certainly wasn't in government, and he'll be moving on to, grooming gun cover up in London, and all of that sort of stuff. So you've got to rebut this. And one of the things that, Tony Blair, Alistair Campbell and Peter Mandelson did as soon as they got into office was the rebuttal unit. Somebody comes out with crap, you rebut it immediately. You don't wait until your scheduled interview next Sunday to go, oh, by the way, I think that was a bit unpleasant. You get out there and you say, oi, stop it. Where's this? And that's why there's no energy, because that instinctive response isn't there, as Kevin said. So, that's what they're lacking.
Yeah. Just a final point on that by-election. We talked about how damaging it could potentially be for Labour because it was a very poor result for the government. But Conservatives, 2% of the vote, Joe.
Yeah,
and I'm not suggesting that Wales has ever been a bastion of Toryism, but nonetheless, they've always put up a decent show. 2%, they may end up with 0 seats in the Senate if that performance is extrapolated across the elections, the Welsh Assembly elections in May. And we were saying a couple of weeks ago that we were impressed with Kenny Badenoch's speech to conference. It doesn't seem to have hit the mark as far as the electorate are concerned, not just in terms of that by-election, but the polls generally. They're still bumping along at, I've seen one poll, 12%.
Yeah.
It's just not getting any better for the Tories.
No, and of course, there are always something there to remind me. Boris Johnson turning up at the COVID inquiry, hair all askew, shirt very carefully untucked, looking like he didn't know anything, blah, 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 blah. It's a reminder of how utter crap they were. And actually, I don't think people are that stupid. They know perfectly well that a lot of the problems, like the asylum hotel things, started under the Conservatives. They also know the overcrowding and the problems in our prisons started under the Conservatives. They know the lack of funding in our schools, the lack of affordable housing. All of those things started under the Conservatives. It's somehow or other, the challenge for government is to marry up the fact that people know they've inherited an absolute pile of crap, and it's everywhere you look. But people also want results quickly. And the other thing that I think is really going to be a problem as we get closer to the budget, it's got cold. People are putting on the heating. People are worried about the cost of living, and the price of food, groceries, is going through the roof. And if you've got kids to feed and you've got 3 jobs trying to keep the roof over your heads, feed the family and keep the house clean and warm, it's a real problem for people. And people need to see and feel something that is positive, and there's very little going around to make people feel positive at the moment.
Yes, and Rachel Reeves has a big job on her hands to make that story different, and I think it's 26th of November, isn't it, that budget? Yeah. So we're waiting to see. Lots of rumours, of course, and things being trailed, as there always are in the run-up to a budget, because they are trying to see what will fly and what will be popular. So we wait and see. So we will close our podcast for this week. It was great to be joined by Kevin, who had to hop off just 5 minutes early for a pre-arranged meeting, but he's going to be back next Monday because Jim Hancock is continuing to enjoy his triple lock pension and is away to sunnier climes, I'm sure. So hope he's enjoying himself wherever he is. We'll see you again in 7 days' time. Thanks for listening to the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.